Monday night on The American Experience, Houston PBS aired Freedom Riders, a documentary exploring how the Freedom Riders set out to challenge the status quo in the South and ended up changing a nation. Tonight on Houston 8, we'll continue the conversation about this movement with a panel made up of individuals who were personally involved in the 1961 Freedom Ride from Los Angeles to Houston. I'm Ernie Manous, and this is Houston 8. Joining us tonight are Herbert Hamilton. Mr. Hamilton was with Texas Southern University, one of the coordinators of the August 1961 Freedom Ride into Houston's Union Station. Steve McNichols was a student at UCLA when he joined the Freedom Rides out of Los Angeles, bound for Houston. Currently, Mr. McNichols is a civil rights attorney based in California. And Robert Farrell, former Los Angeles City Council member, was also a rider in the Los Angeles to Houston Freedom Rides. Gentlemen, thank you all for joining us today. The first thing, before we even get into it, I want to thank all of you for what you did for all of us by this piece of history that you lived and were involved with. Mr. Farrell, I'll start with you. The idea to come to Houston came from where?
The Congress of Racial Equality. As you know, the Congress of Racial Equality started the Freedom Ride.
And that's known as CORE for folks.
That is CORE, yes. And it was something that was electric. The activities of earlier in the year, with the Freedom Ride starting in May, the almost collapse of the Freedom Ride when the leaders, including James Farmer and others who'd started the initial ride, were taken into custody, and the extraordinary position taken by students in the Nashville student movement, Diane Nash, who you saw in the film, an extraordinary student leader. Many of us across the country who were in school, who were involved in civil rights concerns on campus, rallied to the call to do something, to take the Freedom Rides. Mm-hmm. And our opportunity happened to show up, Los Angeles to Houston.
Why to Houston?
Houston is a very important city. Between Los Angeles and New Orleans, which was the southern terminus, as you know, you had a student population, you had an active student population at Texas Southern, and the Progressive Youth Association reached out and said, give us a hand, and that was what this was about. The undercurrent in all of this is that for the first time, students on campus made a significant contribution to the governance of the United States, and that's sometimes lost in the process. But we did it in 1961.
Mr. Hamilton, knowing that the ride is going to come to Houston, good idea, fanning a flame, leading to trouble? What's your feeling about that at the time?
Well, my feeling was good because I wanted them to come and it would change some of the ideas of our mayor, city councils, and everything else, because we was not, Houston was a great town, but we was not getting the kind of recognition that we wanted, and they was not moving in the direction that we wanted to go and get our stores and stuff integrated, where we didn't have to stand outside and order food and all this other stuff.
But you'd seen earlier in the year the things that were going on in other cities when the Freedom Rides came through there. Worry about that kind of an outburst happening in Houston, because as I understand, even if things weren't equal in Houston, it was a calm city at that time.
Yes, it was, and we didn't think it was going to have that type of situation going on, because in Houston, we never did have people just jumping on our students. The police, one of the things that in each one of the demonstrations that we had here, we had the police there in our, for us. Mm-hmm. And most of the time, I would call them, police and the television cameras, to be there so that anything happened, it would be caught on film and we can see what was going on.
Right. Mr. McNichols, why did you join? What was it that made you want to be part of this?
I came from, well, first of all, I was brought up in a very tough Puerto Rican neighborhood in New York. I was the only white kid in my neighborhood. And my parents were very progressive. And so I was imbued with a commitment to equality to begin with. But secondly, as I watched this going on, I became, really committed to what was going on and watching it, watching the bus being burned in Anniston, watching all the freedom rides going. And I just decided that this was something I had to do. And I had a summer job, and I finally quit my summer job to go on what we thought was the last freedom ride to Houston. And actually, it was the last freedom ride, the only freedom ride to Houston. But we took off on August 9th from Union Station, 11 of us, and we took a train to Houston's Union Station, arrived the next day.
And I'm trying to find the right way to ask this question. And I'm wondering your family, your friends' reaction to the fact the African Americans have a problem here. You're a white man. You're putting yourself into a different situation. You can walk away from this. What was it within you that gave you the drive to say, no, this is what's right?
Well, first of all, my family didn't want me to go, but philosophically they couldn't argue against it because all their lives they've been fighting some of these battles themselves in New York. So they couldn't come to me and say, what you're doing is wrong. They could only come to me and say, we wish you wouldn't do it. Mm-hmm. Plus, I was involved in something that was called the student movement on the West Coast, which ultimately morphed into a student political party at Berkeley called Slate, and then the SFM, Student Free Movement. I'm sorry, I'm mixing up the name.
Free Speech Movement.
Free Speech Movement.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah. It's a good thing you're here, Robert. Just back me up as much as possible, will you? Free Speech Movement. Yeah. So I had been kind of affected before the Freedom Riders ever came into view, really. I was president of a student political party platform at UCLA, and it was just a question of my making the decision, and it was almost a religious, I'm not a religious person, but it was almost a religious thing for me, and that was to decide to go. Yeah. And once I decided to go and signed up with CORE, that was it. I was going.
Similar question, Mr. Farrell. You have seen what's happened in other cities. You've seen the violence that's broken out. You've seen the burning of the bus and the beatings and all of that.
Yes.
Where do you find it in yourself? I know philosophically it's a great idea. You sit there and say, I want to see change. I'm going to be part of it. But inside, you know the risk. How do you overcome that to do this?
Well, and let me put it this way. There was an undercurrent in American society. There's still an undercurrent in American society that if you're African American, you run the risk of injury or death. I mean, once upon a time, lynchings were common in the United States. All of a sudden, post-World War II, the lynchings are gone. But the segregation is still there. And for those who were arguing for desegregation, we were not naive. We knew that there were risks. But for black people, these are everyday risks. What more risk is there in going on a freedom ride? Yeah, you could be killed in this process. But you can be killed in the context of the 1960s by being an African-American man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Remember, Emmett Till died in Mississippi because he ostensibly winked or whistled at a black woman. This threat of violence has always been there. So for me as a student to be involved in a protest against a governmental non-compliance with Supreme Court decision, it was no more risky than anything else important that one could do in life.
And as much, first of all, you're all heroes, and I can't get past that point. You all play it so matter-of-factly, but what you did, you took amazing risks to make change, and you all, our gratitude goes out to you. But when you talk about this, in this noble moment, there had to be moments on these vehicles going into this unknown area that fear had to be there. I'm seeing a nod down there from Mr. McNichols.
Yeah, in fact, it was very funny because when we got on the train, we were, I think, carefree and relatively casual. We had fun, and, you know, we had a drink in the bar car and all this thing. But the closer we got to Houston, especially the next morning, the tighter we got, and the more uptight we got. So when we finally arrived in Houston, you know, we were very tight, I would say. At least most of us were. And getting off the train and watching us being photographed by a police photographer as we walked to some cars was kind of a strange experience that most of us hadn't experienced before. So the closer we got to the situation, in some respects, the more uptight we got until we actually sat in, and then for some reason, we didn't feel that uptight, right?
Right.
I mean, there was something about sitting in that was a release, sitting in at the counter in the Union Station coffee shop. Actually doing the sit-in was a big release for us, and getting arrested. In fact, a couple of people made jokes when they were arrested. You know, Steve Sanfield looked at the cop and said, "But officer, nobody has asked me to leave." And the cop said, "I'm not a judge." You know?
Okay, you're getting a little ahead of the story, though. I want to hold you before we get you all arrested.
Sorry.
Mr. Hamilton, coming into the city, what are you doing? How are we preparing for this arrival?
Well, we had prepared other students in Houston, you know, our people, to meet them at the train station and be there for them and be there with them, and let the police and the newspaper know that they was coming into Houston at the time and when, so that they couldn't get hurt. To me, most of the time we had never had any incident in Houston where they tried to jump on, beat, hurt any of the people who were sitting in. So the main thing is we still didn't want that to happen.
Where, timeline-wise, when does the Freedom Rides hit Houston as compared to the restaurant sit-ins that were going on in the city? Was Freedom Rides before it? Did it happen around the same time?
No, the sit-ins and things in Houston started on March 4th, 1960.
Okay.
Which was, when they came in, it was a year and about 4 months later, you know. And we'd been arrested, and I guess I was arrested and taken to jail about 12 or 15 times. But we never had any kind of disturbance like that where students was beaten or anything of that nature. And even in jail, most of the time they got out and never was touched, because in going, the cameras, I can't say Channel 8 was there, but we had the other cameras there and the newspapers.
Right.
And, you know, it was the sort of thing that I tried to make sure that would happen, because anytime we had a demonstration or picket or whatever it was, I called the police, which is odd, and the papers and the TV stations to make sure we have coverage.
And on the off chance some of the folks watching have not seen the Freedom Riders documentary, too, to catch them up on what we're even talking about, is that segregation was still going on in the South. And the concept behind the Freedom Rides were because interstate travel had been said that it could not be segregated. Yes. So you were coming into the areas, going to coffee shops, at train stations, bus stations, to challenge these white-only, black-only areas where they should, the segregated areas. And in fact, just by going in and you sitting in the white area was causing trouble. And then they would come and arrest you or move you along or whatever the case may be. Yes. Unfortunately, it didn't just end there. In a lot of cities, there were beatings and burnings and all of this that happened and the violence that took place. From doing this, though, it made a change in the country. And the question that I wonder is, doing the activity of going and riding on the Freedom buses or on the train and going into the area, how do you know it's going to make a change? How did you know what you were doing, or when did you know it was actually going to be effective, that it wasn't just going to be a footnote in history of a bunch of folks came and sat in, caused trouble, got arrested, end of story. How did you know it was going to make a change?
I believed it. I had faith in what we were doing. I had faith in my leadership. I had faith in our strategy. I had faith in the people who were coming together as we were strangers before going on the ride. We came together, we formed a bond, a sense of community with common purpose. We met with people of goodwill and common purpose in Houston, and we were part of the challenge. We had confidence that when the challenge would go down, when we would have our day in court, that we would win and make the dream come true. And we were fortunate. We were in the mainstream of leadership thought and perspective because we did prevail. And we prevailed against a federal government that was not so happy about the fact that we were doing this in the first place. Mm-hmm. That's another one that says that there is a positive role for students whenever and wherever they choose to participate in bringing about changes in their society. Freedom Riders represented that too.
Yeah. Mr. McNichols?
Yeah, if I may. What happened is that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Boynton versus Virginia that interstate transportation facilities, meaning waiting rooms, restaurants, restrooms, were not to be segregated. Okay, and before that, they ruled in Moore versus Virginia that transportation carriers, meaning railroad cars or buses, were not to be segregated. So here you have the Supreme Court ruling without any question that we should be allowed to walk into that coffee shop, sit down and order whatever we wanted. Right. But nobody, not just Houston, nobody was obeying it across the South. And in Texas, I like to think that one of the things that really had an impact was our case, Jones versus State, in which on April 4th, 1962, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned our convictions for unlawful assembly. And I like to think that was a real turning point in the state of Texas. But, you know, the whole country was going in that direction either sooner or later. And there was some violence even after the Supreme Court ruled again in favor of the Freedom Rides. There were SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, volunteers had their own Freedom Rides, and they were beaten up in Macomb, Mississippi after, theoretically, the Freedom Rides were over. So this was a very rough situation, and as you know, we ran into some violence in Houston that we didn't really expect.
Yes.
We thought, hey, this is Houston, you know?
Yeah. Let's take that part of the story. You get here expecting to just go and sit and everything's going to be fine, possibly be arrested. If not, you're going to move on. What do you find when you get here?
The Texas surprise.
Yeah.
To me. We are taken into custody. We go to jail. Texas is in the South. There's the splitting up of men, women, black, white. And then I expect that I'm going to be here until whenever, as this case is put together and we go to court and we have our day in court. But then the big surprise that in a way showed that some aspects of Texas society are just like in other places in the South when those in charge either instigate or turn their heads to what happens when this kind of an issue is presented to people in the joint. And I think at this point I'd like to just refer that to Steve, because not only is he a comrade in this effort to bring about the change, but he paid a special kind of price, he and some of the other white Freedom Riders in the Harris County Jail.
Yeah, I contributed my body.
To the cause.
To the cause.
Explain what happened.
Well, what happened is that we were confronted by a guard in the ID room, which is where they do your fingerprints and take your photographs, who challenged us. Why were we down there and so on and so forth? And then let us know that we were going into a tank with a lot of prisoners, and they knew we were coming, and we better be careful about what we say, because we sort of responded to his challenge. And they held us until, the four white males, they held us until 2 o'clock in the morning downstairs in a holding cell, and then they brought us up. And what happened is that tank had 107 prisoners in it, and it was tightly run by a hardcore clique of criminals. Garland was called the commander. Overstreet was called the lieutenant commander. The guards had come to them earlier and told them to beat us up. And when we showed up, that's what they did. They beat us up for several hours. And I woke up the next day. My right face was about twice the size of the right side of my face was about twice the size of the left side of my face, which some people might think an improvement, but I didn't care for it. And I've been kicked in the face. Bob Kaufman had a big gash behind his right ear. Steve Sanfield was kicked in the eye. It was not a pleasant experience.
The point of the beatings, what do you think they were for? Warning? Stop? Teach you a lesson?
Both. I think the guards, first of all, I think it was just sheer animosity on the part of the guards. But what was interesting about the tank is there were a number of people in the tank who were sort of sympathetic to us, but then the group that ran the tank would do whatever the guards told them to do. And, of course, there were a number of people in the tank who hated us. So they beat us up, but they didn't kill us, which they could have done easily, because they knew that, the next morning when the cells opened and everything else, they would have a problem with some of the prisoners. Mm-hmm. This is the prisoners in the tanks. And my hunch is the guards may have told them, don't kill them, just give them a good beating. I'm guessing at that.
Mr. Hamilton?
Yeah. Notice that one thing, when the Freedom Rides came, which I really wanted them to come, but on our demonstrations in Houston or picketing or whatever we did, we had no whites with us. Mm-hmm. When we went to jail, it was always just plain blacks. And one of the things that made it real interesting was to have the Freedom Rides come, and we have some whites and blacks going, and showing that there is something that can happen.
There's unity there.
Unity. Yeah. It's a unity, and we can make things happen. And I was just glad, but I wasn't sure that I was thinking it was going to be the same, because we never did get jumped on in the jail, but the whites did. And that really hurt me.
And there was if you mind, there was a very funny story, and that is the white women on the Freedom Ride were put into the white tank. But the head of the black tank, a black woman, her lover was head of the white tank. And when she heard that, she sent a message over telling her to try to protect us. So she did. And they wound up holding a vote on whether or not to beat us up. And by one vote, they voted not to beat the 4 white female Freedom Riders.
Really?
That's right.
So if all of that's going on, there is some system in place that is giving orders. It's just not spontaneous anger bursting out.
Oh, no. As you saw in the film, there's connivance and collaboration, as in the PBS film. The civic leadership, whoever and whatever they are, made decisions. As you saw in the film, the KKK and other, and interesting, the class of the whites who were involved in beating up the rioters. These people who were at the bottom, whites, had their 15 minutes before law enforcement would come in, and as soon as the police would come in and shoot a gun or say, that's enough, these lower class white people disadvantaged themselves. Some would believe, like myself, another negative aspect of this white supremacy that's around, we will use these people against those people, and we keep these people down in the process.
So what does that do for you and your thoughts, feelings about human beings in general? What lesson do you take from this? What do you learn from watching these things happen?
It helps me understand the challenges that we face in the United States, that there are people in leadership positions who can, for example, in Houston, so shut out media coverage of civil rights disturbances, the leadership of students such as those at Texas Southern University, to say that when desegregation comes in Houston, we're going to do it on our timetable, and we're going to say when it's going to happen, when we're going to desegregate the retail stores, when we're going to desegregate the restaurants, when we're going to desegregate the hotels. And we're going to do it in a way that works to the advantage of us and our civic leadership, with us making up our minds to do it.
And just to give equal time to the other side, that there was a very strong thought in that period that also that if you took the media attention away, the riots wouldn't break out and desegregation could happen with less hoopla around it, surrounding it. But two different sides of a story of a difficult time.
Oh, absolutely. And it seems as though a strategy that leadership did in Houston was akin to what leadership did in North Carolina and some other places. Across the South, people responded. It was just.
And I am going to have to stop you there. I hate this, but we are out of time, and they're counting me out. Gentlemen, thank you so much. A fascinating story. I'm sorry we didn't have more time, but thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
Now, each week we invite you to visit our home online at HoustonPBS.org. Simply click on the local program bar, pick Houston 8, and you can join our online community. Read more about the guests, learn more about the topic, and even watch past episodes. A programming note: next Friday night on Houston 8, an encore presentation of our interview with Stanley Nelson, the director of the Freedom Riders documentary. Immediately following that program at 8:30, we'll present an all-new special, A Conversation on Race 2, Houston, Civil Rights, and the 1960s. Joining us on that panel will be civil rights activist Reverend William Lawson, Otis King, Derek Mohammed, and Cherry Steinwender, and others. So please tune in for that. If you have a question or comment for that panel, feel free to email us at houston8@houstonpbs.org. Have a good night. Thank you.